everyone, Professor Jesus. My name is Ernesto Cruz Rosales. I am a student of University eExpro, and this is my video about English through translation, or learning English through translation. To begin with, let's go over the history of translation. We can see here in this timeline that the history of translation is divided into 4 different phases. The first phase of translation starts in the year 3100 before Christ, where Egyptians developed the first inscriptions in God's language and also in slavery language to share knowledge and improve slavery life. Also in the same year, translations from Hebrew, more specifically the language Angelical, into Arabic began to improve math and agricultural knowledge. In the year 2000 before Christ, ancient works such as the Sumerian poem Gilgamesh, which was translated into Asian, or the Indian documents, which were translated into Chinese, of course, were translated along with some Greek texts, translated and adapted into entertainment literature. By the year 347 before Christ, Saint Jerome, who's now considered one of the most famous translators, translated the Bible from Greek and Hebrew into Latin. Then the third phase of translation began in the year 300 before Christ, where the term metaphrase, which means word-for-word translation, was born. In the same year, the Arabic scholars translated Greek texts, which later were translated into Latin, providing the foundation of Renaissance academics. In the same year, Romans came in contact with Islamic and Spanish cultures and used translation to conquer the world in order to communicate. Well, they used translation to communicate with different cultures. Then, in the Anno Domini, the fourth phase of translation begins. In the year 201, in the 3rd century, the religious phase of translation began with the translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew to Greek. It was named Septuagint. Then, in the year 1501, during the 16th century, translation became a very popular method in teaching a second or foreign language. Then, in the year 1531, Gaspar Antonio Chi, who was a Yucatan Indian, worked as an interpreter, and he interpreted between Spanish and Indian, and also participated in the writing Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán. In the year 1805, Sacagawea, who was a female Indian, worked as a translator in the Lewis and Clark expedition, translated between Shoshone and English. In the year 1831, Alexander Burns, who was a British interpreter, worked for the British government and was sent into a mission taking advantage of his knowledge of Hindi, Persian, and English. Also, in the year 1875, Mark Twain, a famous American writer, translated one of his books using back translation and getting an absurd result without sense. Even though this attempt for Twain to translate in a very specific way didn't work, he did that in purpose in order to show how ridiculous it could be to translate phrase by phrase without taking into consideration some other aspects to make texts look logical and accurate, and of course understandable. Then in the year 1901, the age of translation began with the translation of documents in crime courts against Nazis. In the year 1908, Jorge Luis Borges translated The Happy Prince into Argentinian at the age of 9, and later he continued translating some other works. Finally, in the year 1991, we have that is the current age of translation. Several authors suggested that teaching grammar can really help learners get proficiency and accuracy in second language acquisition. So right now that we have checked these aspects of the first kind of and most relevant aspects or events related to translation, I guess that, it is time to go over a little bit or a very brief reflection about translation. First of all, I would like to say that translation, in my personal opinion, has been the target of several critics, especially because, some people argue that, it's not possible to learn English or even to understand something clear by translating it. But, I guess that this idea goes beyond that. because well, we have to consider several aspects to do such thing. But well, what it is true is that it continues existing and it continues being used. So we cannot talk about English learning, understanding, and sometimes teaching without considering translation. It's pretty clear since long time ago that translation has been considered a necessary tool used by several cultures like Romans, Greeks, etc., specifically in order to transfer activities in an implicit or explicit way, as it mentioned in the eXpro lecture. And also, well, the first phase of translation was used to communicate with other cultures and with other groups of people who were part of a society, right? So, well, even these different cultures differ in the way the information should be translated. This technique was used to achieve specific purposes, as I mentioned before, such as conquering other cultures or communicating with slaves, etc. I'm pretty sure one of the most important reasons for using translation was to keep communication with other civilizations during the conquer battles held by the big empires such as the Roman and Greek, and later understand the different languages used by those conquered communities, and also let them know about the rules in general, establish communication with their people, and help them expand their domain and power. I guess that another main goal of translation is to understand, or was to understand and acquire different cultural aspects of other civilizations. For example, I think that some cultures translated literature in order to be familiarized and expand their own cultural background and enrich it at the same time. What happened to the Greeks and Romans, right? That they adopted different aspects of culture from the conquered towns, right? I guess that we cannot talk about the use of translation without pointing out another important use, that was communication. I firmly believe that due to the difference in language of the different civilizations, translation and interpretation had to be learned and developed by some people in order to help their kings, for example, or governors to keep communication with others, and in that way create alliances, interchange products and battles, etc. So well, translation took part into communication for several important things, right? Also, well, the need for trading food and other merchandise made cultures learn the language of other regions, and in some cases, being able to develop the ability to translate and also interpret those languages to people in their own territory. So the exchange of products could happen successfully, and in that way, help those civilizations grow. So, well, going to another part of this subject, religion has also used translation for its own purposes. Specifically, against the spread of specific religions are it's well known. And well, even though this also took place by torturing, forcing, and conquering other civilizations, priests had to learn to communicate with the people of other cultures and in such a way adapt the texts in order to spread the word among the groups of people, the townspeople or the conquered people, right? So, well, I guess that here, um, my personal experience as an English teacher, I had to say that, well, it is an important tool. And according to the history of translation, or the first years of history of translation, it's being used for several purposes, such as communication and etc. And also, well, I guess that it is very important to consider it in understanding another language, as we saw here. Now, I would like to go to another part of English, well, English translation. So, well, this is what I did for activity 3, that was translating or translation, right? So, well, first of all, we can see that the chronological approach to translation studies that have been adopted so far would create a wide variety of ideas about this topic. That's why a limitation in the model is necessary. Holmes is a person who came up with a diagram about translation, but didn't consider it as a tool for language teaching and learning, so it has to be situated under applied translation, which considers the descriptive translation studies, which were shown in a new diagram that considers product, process, and function. Then going to the process of translating, I guess that, well, the practical approach is the same as determining how to transfer source content into target, and also, well, the models for translating take into account the factors involved in the construction of video translation. From here we can go over the models for translating. We have three: linguistic, text linguistic, and sociocultural. The linguistic studies the linguistic resources of source and target languages, the mechanisms available in target languages for overcoming differences. It is not an applied model. That means that it deals with systematic relations between languages, and it's very abstract, right? Then the text linguistic model considers the different uses of the language by speakers or writers in specific communicative situations. This means that the use of target language with a purpose, right? And the communicative values of the source texts are transferred in a translation. Then the last model, that is the sociocultural model, considers that translations have to be read like translations. I mean, they should be an oblique representation of the source text and should also resist domain values and make clear that it represents some of the linguistic and cultural differences, overcoming the foreignness of the source. Now we can talk about some models for translating. We have computational, which basically is done through a machine translation, psycholinguistic, that is based on the TAP protocol by Lorcher, who will divide this translating process in three parts: understanding the ST, transcoding SL into TL or target language, and formulating TT, right? The problem with this model is the pedagogical concepts considered, because they have no some psychological realization. Finally, we have the interdisciplinary model, which mentions that exact equivalence between L1 and L2 is very rare. I mean, lexical and grammatical resources are used when the first of the second fail, and translation is then a synthetic process that considers pragmatics, constraints, knowledge of the world, and meaning systems that join. Then we can move to the critical approach. The critical approach presupposes a finished translation, and according to the critical approach, there's a difference between the criticism of translation and translation criticisms. And also it says that the description of grammar and lexicon needs a description of cognitive and interactional frames. Here it says that language users interpret his environment, formulate some messages, and understand other messages, accumulating an internal model. So a negotiation between different language systems should exist, and they are criteria-based reference of words and or terminologies. Then let's move to translation theory today. It is mainly concerned with translation criticism, but goes beyond that. I mean, it also considers overt versus covert translation, the thing that do all foreign values disappear in translation, pragmatics, and finally literally texts and specially texts. Talking about overt versus covert translation means that, covert translations happens when the translation is not marked, I mean, either as a source of translated text, but may have been created originally, and the overt translations consider the different cultural assumptions in the two language communities. Then, the question, do all foreign values disappear in translation, mentions that cultural conventions play an important role in socialization. That means that textual knowledge, or culture bound, is very important for literary translation, but it's also important when texts with an ideological charge are translated. Talking about pragmatics, a translation theory today says that when we want to express something, that are some encoded elements, but also inference and presupposition play an important role in giving meaning. So if a TT functionally equivalent to the ST wants to be created, register and text type need to be preserved carefully. Finally, talking about literary texts and specialist texts, it says that even though some consider that fiction and factual texts are different in context and meaning, it's very difficult to assure that. It says that metonymy and metaphor, that is, indirect description and a verbal equation, are two things presensory in all types of language. And finally, it says that texts usually create interest because of their content and not by their textual appearance. That means that people are interested in content. Then it talks about the translator's competence. There are several skills that translators need to develop. First of all, translators or competent translators should be competent in the knowledge of the two language systems and also in communicative knowledge. That means that a person with linguistic competence in two language cannot translate automatically because, well, bilinguals use their knowledge when appropriate communication situations happen and never use translation. So these are two completely different things. Finally, it says that translating and interpreting requires specialist knowledge and skills that are not innate to cultural systems need to be dominated for this. So we can see here it is necessary that a competent translator goes over different skills, and not for being bilingual you will automatically be able to become a translator. Then, well, I would like to talk about teaching translation. Well, teaching translation is a process which is usually done under university interpreting and translation degrees. You need to study to become a translator, right? It has become very popular in Europe due to the creation of jobs to interpret and travel and translate within the US because of different economical interchanges, etc. And also the popularity of shows and all these things. Also, there's an increasing awareness of the importance of different translation and interpreting models. And finally, translation is being used in order to prepare future professionals, which involves intensive language work, which means foreign language teaching and learning. So, for this, in order to teach future professionals, the current creation of translation and interpreting degrees in different Spanish and Latin American universities, along with the number of courses for postgraduating and specialization, have turned attention to this discipline, and translators then need to focus on the practical aspects of total proficiency in both source language and target language, along with the translation techniques. That is why some skills need to be acquired by translators. Some of these skills are that, proficiency is not the only need for foreign language. It is also a very good command of the translator's mother tongue, which is even more important than, proficiency in the first language. Also, translators are immersed in a cultural transfer, so they have to be bicultural, more than bilingual. That means acquiring sociocultural knowledge. Finally, it's very common that foreign language students who apply for some translations or interpreting degree courses have an acceptable command of L2, but their ability to use their mother tongue in a practical way is really low. So that's why it's necessary that they improve their command and use of L1 before in order to improve foreign language teaching. Also, here we can talk about some difficulties when translating. There are several difficulties present in the translation process, but some of the most relevant are lack of proficiency in the target language. These are the kind of errors which are not really readily apparent because the lexicon and syntax are normally correct, so the text makes sense, so it's not like very easy to identify. And in the way we interpret texts, we do not really, how can I say, we don't really can be aware of how it affects the translation, or automatically we kind of find a way to make sense of the text we read. Another difficulty is the lack of proficiency in the source language. It's an inappropriate and inadequate kind of translation. This is when the translation doesn't make sense and can lead to pitfalls, which we will talk about later. And then the lack of intercultural competence or sensitivity shows the lack of sensitivity in dealing with translations and paying attention to the context and its characteristics. So now that we have checked all these aspects, it is time to go over, what the chapter 4 talks about, which is translation as a language teaching tool. So, now we can say that translation is a skill of interpretation and re-expression based on knowledge of facts and language. In the classroom context, the expectations are lower because translation is considered the point of view of learning a language. Here, Stern distinguishes between two different dimensions of translation: intralingual and cross-lingual. So, translation is the main technique here in the cross-lingual dimension. In language teaching, translation uses L1 as a reference system, although cross-lingual activities aren't normally mentioned. Well, now Stern talks about advantages of translation. There are mainly three. The first one says that checking on accuracy and using many sources, it's also the least time consuming resource, so it can be such as a good alternative for teachers. Also, the awareness of content and form. Translation exercises can show students that in order to find suitable expressions in the target language, reformulations of some language into items are added. So, well, obviously they can be aware of different items by translating in class. Also, he talks about cognitive and psychological reasons. That means that when students are confronted with a foreign language, translation happens consciously or subconsciously. So this process is a way to confirm or discard some students' hypotheses about target language. Now let's talk about the grammar translation method. Translation has been considered in a negative way since the days of the grammar translation method times for several reasons. But this method is currently used at school to help students learn a foreign language. Proof of this is, several classes where these kind of exercises are included or mainly used. Here I would like to mention something. We are talking about translation as a tool for analyzing and acquiring second language. This is not the same as translating professionally, right? So, well, now let's talk about recent approaches to translating in the classroom. John and Lee Soares mentioned that translation is a continuous use in language teaching nowadays, seen as going back to the retrograde days and comparing L1 and L2 language systems. Students' insights into second language are furthered so much the better. They also believe that students can think they understood the meaning of something, but be wrong, sorry. So translating into their L1 can show this situation. I mean, they can be aware of this. I mean, if they were, for example, talking about false cognates or false friends, this is what it talks about here. Also, they say that many students do not like use translating consciously or subconsciously, and formalizing this should ensure accuracy. Also, they said that while students' cognitive awareness of English compared to their own language is heightened, and also while teachers need to make sure that students translate for concept and not for form. This is very important. Although it's very difficult to achieve that in real life due to the complexity of this task and of course the students' level. Also, if students are looking for benefits in translation exercises, translation of longer passages should be used depending on the level of the group difficulty and intention of the text. It's important always to consider the level of English or the students and also the difficulty of the text. Then we're going to talk about some steps to translation. There are basically four. The first one is the preparatory exercises. The preparatory exercises can be used, or activities that can be used as a prelude of the translation activities. They are like what Stern considers interpretative treatment of the texts, and the intention is that students are aware of how or if they were able to get the original author's intended meaning. Also, we can talk about parallel texts. These are literary texts or extracts from this kind of texts. And well, the only problem here is that they are usually in a very higher level for students, but if we are careful and we read them in detail, we could use some of them to make them or make students use translation as an activity to compare L1 and L2, and then also of course acquire a second language. Another steps to translation is translating L2 to L1. And while this process involves using texts provided in textbooks, determining register and learning how to use dictionaries, also translated into L1 by either students or teachers, and will focus on the use of expressions in L2 compared to L1. And finally, consecutive interpreting of an oral message uttered by students or by other students. Finally, the last step for to translation is translating L1 into L2, and it's one of the most used in grammar translation method, which consists literally on translating sentences even if they didn't make a lot of sense. Here it's important to mention that inverse translation shouldn't be attempted at least at lower levels. So well, little by little, and well, as well as students are acquiring more grammar and familiarize more with the L2, it would be possible to do inverse translation. Otherwise, it would be a bad idea because they would just get confused, frustrated, and well, they couldn't find the appropriateness and adequacy of the text. Talking about translation, there are like several pitfalls or traps, negative things, that can happen when we try to translate. There's there's a huge list of pitfalls and traps, but some of the problems are that very long sentences that can be split easily due to the position, relative clauses, etc. Also, some sentences that don't have a main clause. Also, well, technical terms from a discipline that are not the same in another discipline can get like confusing and make this impossible. Also, well, ambiguity and false cognates or false friends interfere here. Repetition and redundancy. Also, register with devices not existing in L1. The use of metaphors, allusions, or unfamiliar connotations. The use of idioms, proverbs that don't have a standard translation. Some specific humor, irony. All these elements make it make translation difficult to understand or to do. Neologisms, also L1 words that appear in the L2, like for example the texts mention something related to smoking. Smoking is not exactly the same in Spanish. That is a kind of elegant suit that we use in specific occasions than, for example, in English language, that is the verb of inhaling smoke from a cigarette or a cigar. Also, untranslatable terms, abbreviations, personal titles, forms of address, currency values, cohesion and coherence. This is just like an example of a list of pitfalls and traps that make it very difficult to translate, right? Then finally, let's talk about process versus product. Talking about using translation inside the classroom, right? Here we can see that the process is more important than the final product. Handing out a fairy copy of the translation to students, which is normally or very common, is negative for them because, first of all, students will always feel that they failed in their version, or if their version is not identical, so they may feel that they did a bad work or they are not good at English, and that also demotivates them, and well, it is a fact or something very important that can make them even quit or stop learning English or lose the interest. It also gives the impression that there is only one way to do the job. There's another problem due to the fact that teachers are not normally native speakers, so the copy that is given to them can be unnatural, stilted, or hypercorrect. Also, the correction of post-correction stage here is a good opportunity for further contrast between different versions of summary translation along with the notes taken before. And while translation class is a good opportunity for students to get dictionary skills, and while translation should not be used as a means of testing for grades. It's just like a tool that we can use to make students compare some texts and start working on their grammar, their kind of writing, punctuation, and also try to analyze if they got main ideas. Well, in conclusion, I could say that translation is a very useful tool that was born many years ago, and it has been used to make communication possible, even though it's been the target of either good and bad comments because of the grammar translation method to English learning. I guess that it can be, if we know as teachers how to take advantage of it, a good tool to make students be aware of different aspects and compare them, especially some aspects between L1 and L2. And also it can be a very good tool that can make students become proficient in dictionary use and also in acquiring new techniques of writing, perhaps punctuation, etc. This subject was really helpful for me because I learned many things. I was just familiarized with translation in the way that many people, I guess it is, that is just like going into the professional way of translating things. Also, well, I wasn't aware and I didn't even know that translating texts from one language to another involves like specific set of steps, which at the beginning were a little bit difficult for me because, well, there were many expressions that were used, especially in the second activity of the translation text, that, well, made me analyze this kind of activity and realize how important is the job that translators do in order to try to make these messages become as clear and understandable as possible for people. Of course, translating involves many different things that make it a very hard activity. However, I guess that it's necessary to expand communication and, of course, to keep a communication going. But while talking about the English teaching and English learning context, I guess that we as teachers need to be aware of these steps and need to be aware of translation and realize that translation exists, and it is like a way that many students can express themselves. We shouldn't like avoid using these exercises. However, it is necessary to plan and select very carefully the kind of text that we are going to use, how we are going to set the activity. The steps need to be really clear. Also, I guess that the kind of exercise chosen has to be appropriate for students according to their interests, their contexts, and also their context, and also their level of English. Also, well, I guess that as the text mentioned, we shouldn't like give them an only way or a final or the correct version of the translation. I guess that all kinds of translation could be correct as long as students understand them. However, there are different things that need to be kind of translated in a specific way. I guess that that's why a group work can be implemented in this kind of exercises, and also everyone should participate so the whole group can come to a similar translation result or translating result. I guess that, well, I would like to thank you, teacher. This subject was really good. I learned a lot, and from this day on I will try to implement translation exercises in my classes because I have read and I have understood the several advantages of it, and I will be taking into consideration also the things that were mentioned in the texts. And well, finally I could say that translation is a very good and ancient technique of communication, and it's a good kind of tool that we can use in our class to make students improve some skills. Thanks for watching.